Before we start this video, a large thank you to Kurt Lee, Duels, Slothful, Duct Tape, and Hans Christian for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. And an immense thank you to Halo Burner and Mr. Fox Gaming for their continued support to the channel this month on Patreon. It is greatly appreciated, gentlemen, and I hope you enjoy the video. Hello everybody, and today we're going to begin our interaction base. I'm just going to throw some cubes in the scene. So what's an interaction base? This is going to be the system that will handle all of our interactions for things like picking up items, opening doors, passing through fog walls, etc., etc. So this is going to be the functionality and the framework for setting that up. And I'm just going to make a little a podium or a post here just to have an object to visually represent us interacting with something. I'm not going to spend any time on it. I'm just going to throw some cubes here and put a material on them, and then we can add in our interactable base class. So if you feel inclined, you can take what is learned in this video today and go ahead and set up something like a fog wall, or even a door opening, or etc., etc. So just take whatever object you have downloaded for a test. We're just going to make sure it's all working before we jump into any of that. Let's add a script to it called Interactable, and later on the fog wall will actually derive from this script, and we'll take some logic from it. So let's open this up here now, and let's delete the start and update functionality, drop in your namespace as is per tradition. And we're going to make some variables here and kind of write out what we want Interactable to do. So what will the Interactable script consist of, or what will kind of encompass this? I guess a better question would be, what are interactables in the game? So as we just said, we can consider levers interactables that will move doors or pull down elevators. We can consider items interactables. You pick those up, add them to your inventory. Fog walls are interactables, and levers operating elevators. So elevator itself would also be interactable when you step on the button. Basically, you can just kind of group in anything in the world that you're actually able to interact with in terms of like an action. So I'm just going to put in brackets here, anything you can interact with. So that's the key word there. Like, you get prompt to do so. Now let's erase this and start writing in some variables. There's a few things every interactable will have, and since this is the base class, we have to think of all those right here. So first, we're going to say using unity.net code, and we're going to make this derived from network behavior in the future, because this is going to be something that most likely some things in the game will be interactable for cooperative players as well. So let's say public string here, and we can use interactable text like so. And this will be the prompt that you get when you enter the Interactables collider. So that brings us to the next variable. We're going to have a serialized protected collider variable for the Interactable collider. And this is what's going to prompt the text when you walk into it. So it's going to be a trigger. So again, let's just make some comments here so it's very clear. This is the text prompt when entering the Interactable collider. We're going to use onTrigger enter and onTrigger exit. And this collider will just be the collider that you want to place under the object or on the object, a child or whatever you want to have there set up, so that when you pass through this collider, it activates the onTrigger enter. So let's make a comment there so it's very clear. And now the next thing we're going to need again is a serializable field. We're going to make a protected bool for host only interactable. And as the name suggests, defaultly this will be true. Most interactables in Elden Ring, basically they're only able to be done by the host. So like certain doors and such, you can't open up if you're a cooperative player who joins the game. The game will only allow the actual host of the game to progress certain areas in the game by doing that kind of thing. So defaultly, it is true. Next, we're going to make a protected virtual void awake, and we're going to check if this collider is null. And if it is, we're just going to get it by saying it is equal to get component. You don't need to do this though, but I find with some of my interactables, sometimes my collider is on the object itself, and for example, for item pickups. And then sometimes it's a parent of the actual object, because the actual object is the mesh and the regular colliders. So like a lever or a door. So you don't have to call it here at all if you want, but I just like having it here sometimes for whatever reason. I'm going to drag it in manually most of the time. So I'm just going to put a comment here, check if it's null. In some cases, you mount to manually assign a collider as a child object depending on the interactable. Okay, so that's good. Now we're going to need to do a few things in the script. So we're going to utilize start as well. And we're also going to utilize, as I said before, onTrigger enter and onTrigger exit. So I'm going to make a public virtual void interact. This is actually going to call when you actually interact with the object. It's going to require a player manager script. So only players can do this. And then let's just copy public virtual void, and let's call on trigger enter and exit. So for those of you who don't know what this does, again, this is called when a collider is on an object and a collider is set to isTrigger. If another collider enters this trigger, then this function is called. And likewise, on trigger exit is the reverse. So if there is a collider inside of the trigger, when it leaves the collider or the trigger itself, this will call. So this makes it pretty easy to set up an interaction system. These two functions are very valuable here. So the first thing we're going to do is go to on trigger enter. We want to declare a player variable by saying player is equal to other. Other is in the collider that enters this trigger, .get component player manager. If the player does not equal null, we want to do some logic, and we want to do the exact same thing down here on trigger exit. So the first thing we're going to do over here is we're going to check to see if this is a host only interactable. So we can say if player.playerNetworkManager.isHost, if they're not the host, and this is a host only interactable, then we can just simply return. Now we can do the same thing down in the bottom, because if you enter the collision here and you're not the host, then it's going to be the same for on trigger exit as well. Then we're going to say if you're not the owner, return. We don't want to run any logic if you're not the owner of the player object. And then we want to actually pass the interaction to the player if they pass all these checks. And likewise down here, instead of passing the interaction, we're going to remove the interaction. So you can copy everything here really and just put it down on trigger exit, because it is exactly the same right to this point, except then we're going to say remove the interaction from the player. So this is basically all of the main logic here, but we need to basically pass these in a more elegant way, and we need to deal with things like having multiple interactions at once if you walk over, say, a couple of dropped items. So we're going to do that. We're going to go to the player here now, and we're going to add a new script called the Player Interaction Manager. And this is going to handle all things with interactions. So let's go ahead and add there a new script, Player Interaction Manager. Call it whatever you like as long as it's clear that this does what it does. So open that up, delete start and update functionality, put in your namespace as is per tradition, and then let's start writing some logic. So we're going to need a few things here, and I'm going to make a note. So we're going to keep a list of interactables, potential interactions, and we're going to obviously reference our player in case we need it. But we're using a list because you can have multiple interactions at once if you're standing over multiple items. Like again, if you have 5 items on the floor and you're standing over them, we want to go through the list one by one. So let's call our player on awake by saying player equals get component player manager. Then let's make a list of interactables. Call it current interactables. Now this is normally where I'd make it serializable so you could see it in the inspector. But I've noticed that on my version of Unity, I'm not sure if this persists for other versions of Unity, you should not serialize it because it will give you an error if the list changes. So if you're adding or removing things from the list while it is serialized, which we are, it will throw an error in the console. I noticed that taking away the serialization causes it not to show an error. So don't serialize it if you're using this version of Unity, or try it out. If you're using a different version, maybe it's fixed or doesn't exist on other versions of Unity. So again, private list interactable current interactable actions. And to start, we can initialize that as a new list. And then we want to use fixed update. No need to use regular update because it doesn't need to be ran every single update frame. We could say if player.isOwner, or is not owner, we want to return. You don't want to check for interactable actions if you're not the owner of this player object. It doesn't make sense for you to do so. Then we're going to say if our UI menu is not open and we have no pop-ups, then we can kind of proceed with some logic. So what do I mean by UI window? Well, think like your equipment window or your inventory window, and a pop-up will be like a pickup item pop-up or a message pop-up that you get from the game. So let's go and actually make a check for that right now by going to our player UI manager. We're going to create 2 bools for these menus, because they kind of encompass everything. You either have a pop-up or you have a window open. So a pop-up being like a message or a pickup item, and again a window being like a major window, like upgrading your items, changing your equipment in your inventory, all that stuff. So if any of these things are open, you don't want to send an interactable message. So let's make a public bool for menu window is open. Initially it's going to be at false. And a public bool for pop-up window is open. Initially is going to be at false. All right, cool. So I will make a comment here so this is very clear. A menu window consists of things like the inventory screen, the equipment menu, blacksmith menu, etc., etc. And a pop-up menu consists of things like item pickups or just random messages you get. So it could be dialogue pop-ups, or it could be so-and-so has entered your world, etc. And it's just that simple. So Let's jump back over to Interactable, and now we want to, the player interaction manager. We want to check now if either of these is true. So we're going to say if the player UI manager.instance.menu window is not open, and if the pop-up window or pop-up is not open. So we can just say pop up. Then we want to do some logic. What do we want to do? We want to check for an interactable. So we don't have that function here. Let's make that right now. Private void check for interactable. So let's call that. If our menu window and pop-up window is not open on fixed update, we're going to check for an interactable. All right, so what are we doing inside here? Well, we get interactables passed to our list when we enter those collisions, which we haven't done yet because we haven't started passing them, but we're going to assume that they're already being passed. So here's where we're going to sort through our list. So we're going to say if current interactable actions.count is equal to 0, return. We don't need to check for anything if we don't have any. If current interactable actions 0 is equal to null, we want to remove it from the lists because it's a null entry in a list. It'll just be there, but there'll be nothing in that position list. So we remove it by saying current interactable actions remove at 0, and then we return. This could happen, for example, if you go to pick up an item, but somebody picks it up before you, then the entry in the list would still be there, but the item in the entry would be null. So we want to remove that because there's nothing there anymore. So I'll make a comment here too, so it's clear if the current interactable item at position 0 becomes null, we remove the position 0 from the list. And then the next position will become position 0 if there is any at all. So I'll put in brackets too, remove from game. All right, cool. So what's next? Right below that, we want to simply make a comment here, and we're going to say, if we have an interactable item at position 0, we want to send the message of that interactable to our player. So if we have an interactable action and have not notified the player, we do so here. So we're going to say if current interactable actions 0 does not equal null, then we want to send the player a message in the form of a pop-up. So we do that by saying player UI manager.instance, and I believe we have a pop-up manager because I think, yes, we use this for the boss pop-up stuff. So we're going to say player UI pop-up manager.send message pop-up, which does not exist yet. So we're going to make it. So this is just a general message pop-up and can be used for many things like any interactable message prompt or like someone joining your world and stuff like that. All right, so let's write it out and let's also make it require a interactable action to be passed. So we're going to pass current interactable action 0.interactable text. So we're going to pass the text specifically, not the action. And again, this doesn't exist, so let's go make it right now. So if we go over to our player UI pop-up manager and open that up, we can kind of make a function here right at the top. And all we need to do is make a game object and a text mesh pro text field. We're going to have to also add that to our UI prefab after, and we'll do that when we get the logic written. So public void send player message pop-up string message text. So this is very quite simple. All we do is basically say player UI manager.instance.popup window is open is equal to true because now this is a pop-up. And then we want to have some text that we added, which doesn't exist yet. So we're going to pretend that it exists. We're going to say popup message text.text is equal to message text. And then likewise, we also want a game object that we want to enable and disable. But let's actually add the header up here for this first. So I'm going to make a header for message popup. And then we can make a text mesh pro GUI variable for the text mesh pro text. Try saying that 10 times fast. And then we can just call that pop up message text. Okay, cool. So next we also want to have a game object variable that we do enable. So I'm going to call it pop up message game object. This doesn't exist yet either. .set active and then pass true. So let's make that right now as well. Make a serializable field, a pop up message game object. And we can put that just under the header below the pop up message text. Okay, cool. Now let's go ahead now and go into the player UI prefab and let's actually set all this up. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We're going to make an image first for a background so you can see the text easier. And I'm going to edit the width and the height so it's more across the screen, kind of like a long rectangle. And I'm going to, or a good practice I should say, is to make your UI all look very cohesive. So even though I'm not going to spend too much time on it, I'm going to make it look like my other UI. So you can see here we have the kind of transparent quick slot UI over here. I'm also going to anchor this to the bottom of the screen, by the way. I'm going to untick raycast target because it's not a raycast target and that wastes CPU and doesn't need to exist. So that's on the image component there of the background we just made. So I'm going to copy the UI's quick slot colors here, and I'm going to paste them inside here so it looks very cohesive. And then I'm going to change the name of this to message pop-up, and I'm going to add a text Mesh Pro component under it. Go and do alt click and stretch it to the size of the box. I'm going to set the font size not to auto size, but to something like 16 consistently, maybe a little bit bigger than that actually. So 19 we'll try, or 18. Yeah, it looks good. So you can put any message here. This is going to change anyway, so it doesn't matter. So you can call it just interactable pop-up or interactable message. And yeah, that looks good. Also, changing your font goes a long way, just saying. So if you're into the portion of your project where you're actually trying to make it look kind of stylized and nice, it does make it look very nice to find a cohesive style. So I'm going to drag in the pop-up message text. Where did the game object variable go? I swear I just saved that. Oh, I put it under the wrong header. Okay, so I'm going to put this back over here under the correct header because that's going to be confusing if I don't. And I'm going to drag in the variables. Also, a very good practice, guys, to change your variables, especially ones that are just like text, to the name of the variable itself, because if something dramatic ever happens and needs to become unlinked somehow, it probably won't happen, but if it ever does, then it's very easy to find them again, just searching through the hierarchy because they match the variable names. Very good practice. Anyway, back to the script. Right under check for interactable, we're going to make a public void for interact. And as you would guess, this is going to just basically directly reference the first object in our list and interact with it. So we're going to say if current interactable actions 0 does not equal null, we want to interact with this object by saying current interactable actions 0 dot interact. Cool. Now we pass the player here. And then right below that, we want to say refresh interaction list. So this doesn't exist yet. What does this do? Well, it's just going to basically clean up the list and make sure there's no empty objects, because sometimes when you interact with an object, it gets destroyed. A good example of that is picking up an item. It's no longer there after you interact with it. So we want to basically just check the list for any 0 entries or null entries, and again, just remove them. So what we're going to do is make a for loop, and we're going to simply say, we're going to reference the current interactable actions.count. We're going to say -1. We're just going to say if I is equal to current interactable actions.count -1. If I is greater than -1, I minus. And then what we want to do is check for I, and if it's null, remove at position I. So we're going to say if current interactable actions I is equal to null, current interactable actions dot remove at, and we pass I. What is going on? Why is this not autofilling? Oh, so let's put dot remove at first. That's my bad. And then pass the I in brackets. Okay, cool. So this will just basically sort through the list and check for any null entries and remove them at that position. Again, very important. So let's go over to the on trigger enter here on the interactable script. What we want to do now is pass this interaction to the player. So how do we do that? Well, we want to say player.playerInteractionManager.add interaction to list and pass this. This does not exist yet, by the way, this function. We're going to make that very soon. We also can't reference the player interaction manager yet because we have not created a variable for that on the player manager, so we're going to do that next. Likewise, down here, we're going to say player.playerInteractionManager.remove interaction from list. Now let's go set all that up. So first, let's jump over to our player manager, and we're going to make a variable of type player interaction manager. Going to hide it in the inspector because we don't need to see it. Going to make it public. I'm going to call it on awake just like every other variable. Going to use get component. Okay, so let's save that. Jump back over here now to the player interaction manager. Let's make those two functions for add and remove interaction from the list. So I'm going to make add interaction to list. Make this require an interactable. I'm going to call it interactable object. So what are we going to do here? Well, it's a good idea just to refresh the list here just in case there are some nulls. I just like doing it here just to be safe. And if our current interactable actions contains the interactable object, or if it doesn't contain it, sorry, we add it to the list. If it doesn't contain it, we do nothing because we don't want to add it twice. Now on remove interaction from list, we want to basically do the reverse. So we're going to see if we have that in the list, and if we do, we're going to remove it. And then after we remove it, let's just again refresh the interactions list just in case there are any null entries in that list. So we put that after the removal. There we go. Cool. All right, so let's save that now. And we've got the bulk of the system done. Now let's go to the interaction text little podium we've created here. And let's actually make an interactable collider. So let's create an empty game object here. Going to call it interactable collider. And let's set up some kind of collider here with a trigger on it. So I'm going to use a sphere collider, and I'm going to just basically position it so it's in front of that. I'm going to pretend like this is a button and we're going to press it. We're not going to actually, but we want to position the collider where it makes sense. So for me, that's position Y1 and then -1 on Z. I'll increase the radius something like 0.7. That looks cool. So also, to save some memory, we're going to add a layer, and we're going to call it Interactable. And we're going to make it so the only thing this collider will ever pay attention to is players, or characters specifically, I should say. So let's set the layers interactable, set it to a trigger, very important. Next, go to your project settings, go to the physics, and you come down here to the little graph, what are you going to call this? And then make sure that you make it so the interactable layer is only colliding with the character. So it only checks for interactions via physics on the character layer. And then get out of that and we're good to go. So let's go over now and write our interactable text. I'm just going to call interact because this is just testing it and making sure it does in fact work. So let's go back over to our interactable script. And then on interact, we're going to throw a debug.log. You have interacted. And we also want to do a few more things here too. So this will change a little bit depending on your interaction, but most of the logic can be applied to all future interactable objects. So first we're going to check if we are the owner. And then we're going to say player UI manager dot instance dot close all pop-up windows. And this does not exist yet. So let's go make that. When you interact, you have a pop-up and you want to close the current pop-up, which is that interaction message that you already have. So let's just make a public void close all pop-up windows. And now I'm thinking about it, I have this here on Nephilim, but it makes more sense to put on the pop-up manager. So let's do that. Let's go to the pop-up manager and put it over there. So I'm just going to put it right at the top here, close all pop-up windows. Now for closing all pop-up windows, we can also change the bool for a pop-up window is open on the player UI manager. So we're going to do that too. So we're going to say the only pop-up window we have right now is just this general message pop-up. So we can say pop-up message.gameObject.setActive false, player UI manager.instance.popup window is open false. Cool. So let's go back now and reference this from our pop-up manager on the interactable script, like so. Player UI manager.instance.popup manager@close all pop-up windows. Looks good. Let's save that. Next, let's jump back over here to the interact again, and we're going to copy this and paste it on trigger exit. So when you leave the trigger, you also want to close the pop-up. Okay, so we can actually get rid of that check for if is owner because it's already there on trigger exit. Don't need to keep that there twice. Cool, looks good. Now if I go into the game, you're going to notice this is not going to work. Why is that? It should work, right? Well, this is technically a child of this main object, but our script for interactable is on the main object. So this is a child collider with a trigger, but our onTrigger enter is on the main object. So there's no trigger on the main object. How do we fix that? It's actually very, very simple. So you can see here onTrigger enter would you think only be called if we use a collider on the main object. But if we add a rigid body to the main object and make it kinematic, so it doesn't actually affect anything with physics. I'm just going to freeze position too, just because. Basically, any collider that's a child of this object will now be able to use onTrigger enter. So if I go back into the game here now, even though this is a child object, you can see, boom, there's my pop-up. Cool, working as intended. Great. So this doesn't actually do anything right now. Why is that? Well, we don't actually have an input to interact. So right now, pause the video. I know you can do it, especially for this part of the series, and go ahead and make the interaction input. Go ahead. Do it right now. Pause the video. Make the interaction input. You've made inputs a bunch of times. You can figure out where to go from now. So go ahead and pause it. All right, I'm going to continue. So let's scroll down and let's actually make an input. I'm just going to copy any old input here because we just need a bool right away. So let's go to the player action inputs because this is an interaction action. I would consider this an action. Let's copy dodge and change it to interaction input, initialize it at false. Let's go to our player controls now and actually make the input itself. So I'm using a controller for this tutorial series. I'm going to duplicate right bumper because it's a standard button. And then I'm going to change the name to interact or interaction. Interact actually. And then I'm going to change the button from right bumper to Gamepad North. So this will be Y on an Xbox 360 controller, an Xbox One controller, and triangle on a PlayStation controller. So button North Gamepad. All right, let's save that. I'm going to go back down here now. I'm going to copy any regular interactions. So we can just take dodge, for example. We can paste it. We can change dodge to interact.performed, and we can change dodge input to interaction input. And now we actually have to make the function that will check if this has been pressed. This is, again, super straightforward. I'm not going to put it down there below the queued inputs because that seems out of place. I'm going to put it right below handle switch left weapon input. So we're going to call this handle interaction input. The first thing we do is, as a standard, check for the input itself, and if the input has been pressed, we want to instantly switch it to false. So then we're going to basically just interact with an object. Now you could call close pop-up windows here too if you didn't want to call it somewhere else for some unknown reason. Like if you have a certain order of operations and you want to close the pop-up after the button has been pressed, you could call it here, but we actually already have this over here on interact, so I'm going to keep it there. So I will remove it from here, and all we need to do is say player.playerInteractionManager.interact. Okay, now let's call this on the function that checks for our inputs. So under handle all inputs, we want to say handle interaction input. Look at those naming conventions. That just looks so nice. All right, let's save that. Let's go back over to the interactable script, and right after we do interact, we have to do a couple more things. We want to say interactable collider.enable is equal to false. Now this isn't true all the time, but it is true most of the time. So if you pull a lever, you don't want to be able to pull it again. If you pick up an item, you're going to destroy it, so the collider won't matter. And drag in your interactable collider so it doesn't defaultly choose the box collider. Now you also want to remove the interaction from the list if it's still there. So we're not destroying the script in this case because it's just a podium, so we're going to do that too. So we can just actually say up here, honestly, if you're not the owner, return, because all these functions are only going to be called if you are the owner. So I'm just going to move this up top and say if you're not the owner, then return. And now we're going to, again, we're just going to basically close the pop-up window and remove the interaction from the list. And before all of that, we're going to disable the collider as well. So disable collider, remove interaction from the list, and then close all pop-up windows. All right, back on interact, we want to do one last thing. We want to check to make sure the interactions count is above 0, because if it's not above 0, you're going to get an out of index error. I won't do anything else, but it will send you an error message. So let's just say if it equals 0, return. Okay, now we're good to test it. Let's jump into the game, save that. I'm going to minimize this. Now if I walk over to my interactable podium, press interact, boom, you have interacted. If I spam the interact button after that, nothing happens. So you can see how this works now. Basically, we can chain this up to things like going through a fog wall, picking up an item, opening a door, etc., etc. So guys, that is the framework for our interaction system. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you learned something, and I hope you all have a lovely weekend. And as always, a special thank you to my patrons. It is because of each and every one of you I get to keep doing this, and I love doing this. So I encourage you now to go off and try to create some simple interactions yourself. Maybe make a door, make something open. And if you do choose to make something like a door, keep in mind, if it has network behavior, so if you want to sync if that door is open for everybody, you do have to spawn it on the network. So you would do that the same way you spawn any old creature or monster. I strongly encourage you, go have some fun with it, go try to build something. If you mess something up, that's cool, that's how you learn, that is the greatest way to learn. Always attempt these things on your own, especially after you've gained some knowledge on how to do so. Alright guys, I will see you all next week.